Hey everyone, this is Faisal Saleh. I'm the founder and executive director of the Palestine Museum US in Woodbridge, Connecticut, the USA. Today I'm coming to you from Venice, Italy, and with me Krista Brun from Madison, Wisconsin, USA, and we're delighted to have with us our guest Fida Jiryis. More about Fida in a moment. Just to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and it is streamed live on Facebook. At the end of the program, you'll be able to go to Facebook and watch it again there and share it with your friends. Thank you for joining us today. Krista, would you like to introduce our honored guest today?
Yes, it would be my honor. I'm Krista Brun, and I'm really delighted to welcome Fida Jiryis from Ramallah. She's tuning in from Ramallah today, where she's currently living. And Fida is a Palestinian author whose family is from the Palestinian village of Fasuta. And she grew up in Lebanon and Cyprus, and she's the daughter of Palestinian intellectual and leader Sabri Jiryis. And as her family fled Israel's oppression and wars, Fida's life has spanned the full spectrum of the Palestinian people's forced fragmentation in Israel, the West Bank, and the diaspora. Her writings include several collections of Arabic short stories, a contribution to the book Kingdom of Olives and Ash, which was a Washington Post bestseller, and Ha-Kluf, The Cage, which is a Hebrew translation of her short stories published this year. Fida's most recent book, which you can see in her background, is Stranger in My Own Land, and it describes her and her family's remarkable life journey, which is in many respects also the story of Palestine. Fida, welcome, and welcome everyone who's tuning in today with us. We're honored to have all of you here with us today.
Thank you very much, Krista. It's an honor to be with you all. And thank you to Mr. Faisal.
Please feel free to make comments in the chat. And if you have a specific question for Fida, please put it in the Q&A. She will be reading today at some point from her memoir. And so look forward to hearing that. Just to get started, I would just like to ask you, Fida, to speak a little bit, just given your background of being born in Lebanon, growing up in Cyprus, returning to your village, Fasuta, living in Ramallah, even in Haifa. I wondered if you could speak a little specifically to the fragmentation of Palestinians. You've had your own experience of these various places and your own fragmentation, and if you could just talk a little bit about that, it'd be a great way to start. Thanks.
Thank you, Krista, and welcome everyone who's with us tonight. I'm grateful for your time and for being with us. Fragmentation seems to be the Palestinian way of being, one that was obviously not chosen, but imposed on us by the Nakba and its aftermath. When I began to write this book and to have conversations with friends and other people that I met along the journey of the research, it really, Krista, does hit home again and again and again how fragmented we really are. Almost, everyone in my circle, in my immediate circle, has come here from outside or has been to several countries and have lived in conditions of insecurity at some point in their life or in most of their life. Many of us feel that we, as a result of this, we're still not really rooted anywhere. The title of the book, Stranger in My Own Land, talks about the painful feeling of even after a return to Palestine because of the blatant system of discrimination we face and the occupation we still live under in Ramallah and the territory. In fact, we continue to feel this alienation and fragmentation. But in terms of our people, I think it's really a wonder that the Palestinian people have managed to maintain their cohesiveness as a people, despite all the countries that we were flung to. And certainly in my research, I mean, it really is quite phenomenal how far we have gone and how varied the experiences have been of refugee communities in different places. We carry this fragmentation in our soul by this point everywhere we go, I think.
Thank you. That is really helpful, I think, to our guests who may not be aware of just how the impact of fragmentation on Palestinian communities. You know, you were born in Lebanon, so you grew up hearing about Palestine from your family and from other Palestinians in Lebanon. I'd be really curious just to hear more about what it felt like to finally get to go to Palestine, to live there, to be on your land. And if you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be wonderful. Thanks.
So to give the listeners a bit of a background, very quickly, not to spoil the book too much, but my father was 10 years old at the time of the Nakba. And he grew up under the military rule that the new Israeli state very quickly instated on the Palestinian minority remaining in it. He went on to high school and then he studied law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And became an activist for the cause of his people, and specifically to better the conditions of the Palestinians who found themselves in the newly created Israeli state, facing all sorts of repression and persecution. He was also one of the leaders of Al-Ard, which was the first Palestinian national movement to emerge after the founding of Israel. And of course, the movement also was severely persecuted and eventually outlawed. In 1970, as a result of his work, he was voluntarily exiled, and he chose to go to Lebanon with my late mother. There, he directed the Palestine Research Center of the PLO. My brother and I were both born in Lebanon, and we stayed there until after the Israeli invasion in 1982. In 1983, a bomb targeted the Palestine Research Center, where both my parents worked, and many people were killed in that explosion, including my mother. Following that, a few months later, we relocated to Cyprus, and I grew up, you can say my adolescent years were in Cyprus. And throughout all this time, a return to Palestine, we knew that it was impossible. My father had left voluntarily in 1970, and since then, he had worked with the PLO, so there was really no chance of a return as such. Interestingly, so many years later, when I interviewed my father for this book, he said that from the moment he left, he always knew he would be back. And he said, I don't know how exactly, but I always had a feeling that one day I would return. Meanwhile, in the early 90s, I went to a university in England, having finished school in Cyprus, and I came back, I found a job in Cyprus, and that was the future I could see. But then the Oslo Accords were taking place, and in really what I think is a miracle, we are less than a handful of people who managed to exercise the right of return as such to our native village, to the village of my parents, to Fasuta.
Fida,
Yes.
can you tell us, to the extent that you know, how were those people selected, the ones
Yes.
who were given the right to return, and why so few of them? Why weren't there a lot more?
Mm-hmm. So what happened was that there was a particular stipulation in the Oslo Accords in which certain Palestinians who worked for the PLO but who were not refugees, in other words, they had left Israel with Israeli citizenship, could on a case-by-case basis apply and be granted the right to return to their villages. Now, the reason Israel did this is clear. It didn't want to open the door of a refugee return, because then thousands of people that ultimately returned to Gaza and the West Bank would have wanted to go back to their towns and villages inside Israel proper. So it was on a case-by-case basis, and it was really limited to very few people. And this was how we found ourselves coming back. Now, the first time that this took place, you can imagine the shock and the giddy happiness that I was feeling. This was the place we had, grown up hearing about and living, in a sense, all our lives. And here we were finally coming back. I try to capture that in the book, how I felt. In fact, as my uncle picked us up from the airport, it was late at night, and it's a long journey to Fasuta because we are on the Lebanese border. So we are a good 3 hours from the airport in Tel Aviv. I kept asking my father along the journey, where are we? Where are we? How long? And when he finally said, in 10 minutes we'll be in Fasuta, I just burst into tears in the back seat. That was how intense it was. The arrival in the village was like a dream. I mean, until today, it was really surreal. It was almost like a feast took place when we arrived. Our relatives, our uncles and aunts, and so many people in the village, previous, friends of my dad and so on. But until today, I remember how naive I was, in a sense, when we came back, because in my mind, I was coming back to Palestine. I mean, obviously, I knew Israel existed, but really having grown up outside, I had no notion of what it meant to come back to the Israeli state, to come back as a Palestinian inside Israel. And our first visit was only a short visit at Christmas for 2 weeks. And then 6 months later, in June 95, we made the move back for good. And I think that was when my true shock hit me. And that was when it really began, when I really began to understand what it meant to live as a member of the Palestinian community that lives inside Israel, and what kind of very, very complex and blanketed system of discrimination we had to deal with.
Yeah, I know you cover that a lot in your book, your experience of looking for work and being the only Palestinian on staff and things like that. And it must have been really an incredible transition, really, to what you thought was Palestine in your mind and what it ended up being on the ground, living as a Palestinian in Israel. I wonder if you, maybe I'll ask one more question and then we could have you read from your book, which I think would be a real treat for all of us. I know that in your book, your father shows you, for example, one of the destroyed villages in the area, and says, this is Sahmata, right?
Yes.
The village of Sahmata, which is just south of Fasuta, and talks about, the villages that were destroyed in the area. Of course, many villages, hundreds of villages, and dozens in your area, of course. I wonder if you could just talk about how it felt as a Palestinian that your village is still there. And for so many Palestinians, their village is no longer there. And not only not there, but virtually inaccessible to them unless they are internally displaced, which you can, I'm sure, address in your comments. How did that feel to see? I think you mentioned like the ghosts of the villages that are all around you.
Yes, Krista, it's actually interesting that you ask that question, because I've been reflecting for a while, even after writing the book, about this notion of survivor's guilt. This notion usually applies, to people, for example, the sole survivors of accidents or wars, or and to a large extent, that's how it feels, because I recount this in the book. I mean, I went to work in a nearby industrial park, and all around me, on my way to and from work, were the sites of these destroyed villages. And there are only little pieces of stone that are left in the wilderness, because obviously the Israeli bulldozers plowed these villages over. Only some little pieces of stone are left to bear witness. And so as you drive back and forth from my village, south to pretty much anywhere, you are reminded of this daily, sometimes several times a day, if you have to go and come more than once. And so all the time you are living with these ghosts, as I call them, and you really feel their presence, and you really, you feel it even more considering that the people of these villages, most of them ended up in South Lebanon. And from there, they went, obviously, some of them went further north to the refugee camps in Beirut and so on, but they are so close. There's the bizarre realization, and I write this in the book, that actually they are only an hour or two away by car, but they have been away for a lifetime. They can't come back, they can't reclaim their villages. What I felt about this every day was just this bizarre notion, this complete fluke of fate, really, which resulted in Fasuta and some other villages, of course, around us somehow surviving. Due, in part because of the chaos at the time, in part because by the time the Israeli army got to our area, it was really the last area occupied. And by then, the pressure had been building up because of the serious refugee crisis that was happening in the region. At the same time, Count Folk Bernadotte was assassinated at the time, so by the Zionist groups. So this put additional pressure on Israel. There's some speculation that this was one of the reasons that Fasuta and other villages in the area survived. They were a little bit unsure about this at this point, about creating more refugees. In fact, they actually closed the northern border, and many of the villages that were displaced from that point on were internally displaced, if you follow that, the progression of things. And so today, when I look at this and I think, okay, Fasuta survived, it's only through a fluke of fate. And I imagine that life could have been very different, that I could have been one of those refugees in the camps, and I feel their presence all the time, particularly as I painfully realize that I was able to come back and they can't. And it doesn't look like their coming back is anywhere on the horizon. In fact, things are getting, these days worse and worse. The Oslo process has obviously completely failed. Right now, I mean, it feels like another major breakdown. It's always been a low-level state of war, but now it's a complete breakdown again. So for these refugees, that horizon just keeps shifting further and further, and it's very painful because I realize, I am doing something that they so much want to do and can't.
Yes. Thank you for that heartfelt testimony.
Krista,
yes.
Fida, who is the target audience of your book?
Yes, the target, I started writing this book actually, I think when I began, it was actually something in my mind that because of all the places I had traveled to and lived in during my life, I had made many friends in many countries. And quite often I heard, even from my close friends, that, we know there's a problem. We know that, there's a problem between the Palestinians and Israel. We know there are wars and so on, but we really don't understand the Palestinian issue. We don't understand it. We don't know really the details or what it's about or how it started and so on. So my book, when I began, was really to a Western audience, or let's say to any audience that doesn't know much about the history and wants to find out in a one-book version, really. I tried to make a one-book version of the whole story as much as I could. And at the same time, I wanted to document our family's history. And what I ended up doing, and this is a technique that I've seen many other writers use, and it's actually an attractive technique, rather than create a dry history book, once you narrate the events through a family and through a group of people and their ordeals and what they faced in their life and what they did, you make it so much more immediate to the reader. And so the reader is reading my family's story and reading the story of Palestine through it. Eventually, several readers that I've read the book so far, even those who are familiar with the conflict, have told me that they found things in the book that they didn't know. So that was also very gratifying. It seemed that my audience was growing beyond that I had originally intended also.
That's the beauty of memoir, is that you turn memory into story and make a very different context for those who are not familiar with it, very accessible at the human level. And I think that's what your book does so beautifully.
Thank you, Krista.
Krista, maybe
Yes.
this is a good time for Fida to read some.
I agree. We have a couple of questions. We're just going to put them on hold. Nabil and Linda, please be patient. And we're going to let Fida read from her own words. And you go ahead and pick a passage that you would like to share with the audience today.
Thank you, Krista. Actually, in view of it, this year is 75 years since the Nakba. And as I was preparing for the meeting, for our meeting today, I was thinking to myself, as every Palestinian knows that the Nakba has not ended, it is very much ongoing. Although in our consciousness and in the way perhaps that it's defined, and in the world consciousness, the Nakba was an act in 1948, essentially the continuous process of erosion and displacement and dispossession goes on and on and on. Today we are seeing this in the West Bank, and have been seeing it for a long time in a very violent form with the settlers and so on. And even inside Israel itself, the Palestinian minority has never really quite felt secure, obviously. As we were talking earlier also about the Nakba and the destroyed villages, I thought I would read a passage from the book. It's actually the beginning of the book that sets the context for the first few chapters that talk about the Nakba and how it all came about. So I will read that now.
Thank you.
We're leaving. Leaving, my grandfather Elias echoed. The Jews have gotten closer. We've decided to leave until things calm down and we can return. His friend, the old shepherd, replied. In 2 days, they were gone. They took everything, their clothes, blankets, pots and pans. They even took their chickens. Elias' son, Sabri, a boy of 10 at the time, knew this because he went to their village. Riding his father's donkey, he made his way to the Deir, as it was locally known. Deir el-Asi was 5 times larger than Sabri's village, Fasuta, and had been teeming with life. He had often seen its peasants carrying produce home from their fields. But on that day, as he approached it, nothing moved. There was no human or animal in sight. He urged the donkey forward through the alleys. Its steps echoed in the eerie silence, broken only by the rustle of the wind through the trees. The entire village, with its houses, gardens, and paths, was empty, he recounted years later. Wind blowing through it and windows creaking. I've never seen a more depressing sight. The image continues to haunt me when I think of the war. Desolately, he turned the donkey around. As they made their way back, he spotted a lone chicken pecking at the ground and suddenly felt sorry for it. Back in Fasuta, he left the donkey and rushed to his grandfather's house. There was quite a commotion. Tens of people were gathered outside. They were not from the village. Some had blankets and others carried bundles, too heavy for their backs or heads. Babies were crying and children stared with frightened eyes. Cautiously, Sabri pushed in between them, making his way into the house. Some of them had gone inside. He searched the faces fervently until he found his grandfather. Jiryis stood near the kitchen, issuing orders to his wife as more people crowded in. Sidi, Sabri panted, squeezing through the crowd and edging up to him. What's going on? Quiet, boy. Jiryis turned back to his wife, Raji, who was laying a loaf of bread on the table. She opened a large clay pot, filled to the rim with balls of a soft white cheese, Lebani. Deftly, she spooned one out and spread it onto the loaf, rolled it, and handed it to the nearest man. Eat, Jiryis urged him. Please, this is your house. The man looked pained as he took the food and mumbled his thanks. Sabri looked up at his grandfather. Sidi, who are these people? Quiet, Jiryis said, more impatiently this time. Go out and play. Come back later. But Sabri snuck into a corner and waited. Suddenly, a little boy of about his age stared back at him. He was holding his mother's hand. Sabri wanted to talk to him, take him outside to play, but somehow it did not seem right. He looked back at his grandmother, who seemed to be feeding the entire crowd, and felt a slight panic. What if she ran out of Lebanese and could not make him her tasty sandwiches anymore? Finally, an old man in a white headdress stepped up to Jiryis. "Thank you, brother," he said gruffly. "May God repay you with every good. We should be on our way." Jiryis nodded. Beads of perspiration gathered on his brow. He wiped them with the edge of his headdress. Voices of thanks were heard, hollow, cheerless voices, and the crowd began to shuffle, gathering their things. Led by their elder, they began a long trail out of the village. The little boy held his mother's hand and stole one last look back at Sabri. "Sidi, where are they going?" Sabri blurted out. "North," his grandfather mumbled. His wife had come out of the house to join them and stood next to him. As they watched the receding figures, she lifted her apron to wipe a tear from her cheek. Jiryis, seemingly on the verge of doing the same, cleared his throat roughly and instructed her to go inside. They moved into the house as a chilly breeze picked up in the late autumn sunset. "Come, Sidi," he muttered to Sabri, sitting down wearily. He took out his tobacco and rolled a cigarette. Sabri sat next to him and waited. He looked from one grandparent to the other. "I was in the dare today," he said finally. "There's no one there." Jiryis nodded and took a deep puff. Raji retreated to the kitchen. "Where have they gone, Sidi?" Sabri persisted. "To Lebanon." "Them too?" The boy struggled to understand. "Those people just now, are they from the dare too?" "No, they're from Tarshiha." "Why are they leaving?" "The Jews," Jiryis said in sudden anger. "They will destroy the country." You're muted, Krista.
Sorry, I just said, wow, that's a powerful beginning. I think we all need to catch our breath.
Yeah, we
For a
wanted to
moment.
keep going.
Yeah, I think you have us all hooked. For those who don't have the book yet, I think we're going to all be in line, and we will be sharing, speaking of how to get the book, we will be sharing information on that shortly. But Fida, it's hard to fathom your father, a 10-year-old boy, making sense of this Nakba that was unfolding. And of course, at the time, no one knew exactly how things would unfold, that so many people would, you know, not be allowed to return. And so I see what you're saying, how that is really so fitting with this 75th year of Israel's making, and just how to this day, excuse me, to this day, we don't know what the future has in store.
Yes.
For Palestine, for Palestinians, for refugees, for those on the ground and outside. It's as you said, it's more uncertain than ever. But all the more important for something like your book to reach people's minds and hearts, to give them the opportunity to learn and really become familiar at the human level with a piece of Palestine. So I'm so grateful for your words and your presence here today and your work.
Thank
Of course,
you
we
so
look
much,
forward. We
Krista.
look forward to more from you.
Thank you so much, Krista. Thank you. And I do look forward to feedback also once people have read the book. I'm always, very happy to hear from readers about their impressions and about, what they felt really as the story unfolds. The story, of course, I cover about, I believe it's about 60 years or so in this story, but actually a little bit more than that, because I do start out, I give a brief overview of the Zionist movement, which is essentially what led to the Nakba. And I start from the point that I read about now, and I finish now, last year actually, this year even, with the events that are going on. So really, I cover all that stretch of time, and it would be interesting to hear from readers always about their experience of reading the book.
And that's what's beautiful in this day and age, how it's become more, people are more accessible to each other. And I'm sure you will hear from more readers. There are a few questions about your going back to your father. I know you told us quite a bit about him. Nabil just wants to understand a little better how, since your father had an Israeli passport, why he didn't come back sooner, and did it have, you know, anything to do with his wife having been killed, your mother, so tragically in Lebanon? And also tell us a little bit about your father now. And what happened to the center in Lebanon, if you know?
For sure. I will start with the first question. Effectively, he still had his Israeli ID, but had he returned any time before the Oslo Accords, he would have been tried in Israel for working with an enemy organization and obviously imprisoned. So there was really no question of him attempting to come back. In addition, there were actually several assassination attempts against my father in Beirut, particularly during the Israeli invasion and its aftermath. So it was very clear that coming back was completely out of the question. My uncle, my father's brother, who was with us in Beirut, was also in the same boat. It was really only after the Oslo Accords, because, you know, obviously with the stipulation, guarantees were given that, you know, these people could come back and that they would be safe and that they would not be tried, which is even more important, for their previous work with the PLO. The research center after Beirut relocated to Cyprus, and it reopened again there, but on a much smaller scale. In Beirut, it was a large organization. It had more than 80 employees, and it was the largest library and archive on Palestine outside it in the Arab world. So it was really, you know, a big institution, big operation. And this was the reason that Israel and its allies were so adamant to destroy it. The bomb that went off in February 1983 was actually the last in a series of previous attacks in the center. The center had been attacked many times over the years, although on a much smaller scale. After our move to Cyprus, the PLO basically relocated its cultural institutions to Cyprus and retained its political base in Tunisia. That was the arrangement at the time. And I think this was partly done to avoid the situation that took place in Beirut, where everything was based in one country, and therefore, if it was attacked, you know, all of the infrastructure would crumble together. So they took a decision to base the cultural institutions in Cyprus, particularly as the Arab countries simply didn't want them. In fact, the research center, there was some negotiation to reopen it in Egypt. The PLO had entered into negotiations with the Egyptian authorities. My father was even sent to Cairo. He found a building and so on. And at the last minute, they said no, they turned them down. So really, Cyprus provided the only haven at the time. And we relocated there with several other, you know, the Palestinian factions, all their newspapers and magazines and so on also went to Cyprus. After our return to Palestine, the research center continued to exist, but only on paper in the chaos of the initial few years after Arafat's return here. And then afterwards, you know, my father retired, and the center today continues to function, but as a much smaller outfit. And I think they went back to publishing Shu'un Falastiniya, Palestine Affairs, but they publish, I think, a couple of books a year, but it's much smaller.
Thank you for that clarification.
There's a follow-up question, Krista, from Ellen Siegel. Could you please tell us how your father is these days? I wonder if he was able to take any documents from the center with him.
Yes, my father now lives in Fasuta. Miraculously, after all of this journey and 24 years in exile, in 95, when we came back, he started building his house, and he has a house now in the village, and he lives there. He continues to write, to follow the news very ardently. He's 85 this year.
Wow.
Yes, and he's very active still, you know, with news and with the reports and the following up and so on. The documents of the research center were confiscated by Israel during the same days that the Sabra and Shatila massacres were taking place in Beirut, at the height of the Israeli invasion in September 1982. Several trucks showed up at the site of the center, at the building in Ras Beirut, and they worked for 4 or 5 days, emptying all the contents of the center and trucking them to Israel. They did this in broad daylight. And only a couple of years later, there was a prisoner exchange deal arranged through Amnesty. There was a prisoner exchange deal arranged with Israel for some Israeli soldiers that had been taken captive by the Palestinians in Beirut. And as part of that deal, the archive of the research center was returned to the PLO through a third country, Algeria. From there, the archive remained in Algeria. After the PLO relocated here, there were several attempts made to bring it back, but unfortunately, part of the books had been destroyed during that time, and the archive is still in process, really, of being brought back. The latest project to do that now is to bring it back to the Palestinian National Library, which is still effectively being set up and which is facing immense difficulties. That's as far as we know up until now, but it was really a very tragic end to the center all around. And in fact, one image that stays in my mind is while the Israeli army was in Beirut and they were taking all the center's documents, I remember as a child, I mean, I was 9 years old at the time, I was standing on the balcony of our apartment and watching my father going up and down with files and documents and burning them in the dumpster in the street. I later understood, many years later, when I asked my father about this memory, he said this was highly sensitive information that he could not let fall into the hands of the Israelis. So in a sense, some of it had to be destroyed there and then. So it's really, it's a tragic story, Krista, anyway, from any angle that you look at it. And it was really the violent and dramatic end of the Palestinian institutional and cultural presence, as well as the Palestinian presence in Beirut per se.
Wow.
Yeah, we actually showed a film about the film archives that were seized by Israel in Lebanon. And of course, those have yet to be returned.
Yes.
I believe that was an Israeli film, excuse me. So yeah, there are a lot of materials that need a home in Palestine.
Yes.
At the right time. One of our guests, Linda, asked, can you comment on Anton Chama's book, Arabesque, who's another son of Fasuta? He was actually my professor when I was doing my master's at University of Michigan Center for Middle East and North African Studies way back when. And so I actually know him personally, and I wonder, I'm sure you do as well, but if you could comment on his book and your brother and sister of the village of Fasuta.
Yes. Anton Shammas is actually my second cousin. He is my mother's
Oh my goodness.
cousin. Yes.
Okay.
I have never actually met Anton in person, but we corresponded a lot during my writing of this book. In particular, the opening quote of the book is from Arabesque. And I can actually, if you permit me, I will very quickly, because it's right here. It's right just before the passage that I actually read. So I will just quickly read it. Not on names and places, sorry, just one moment.
And by the way, while Fida was speaking, answering questions about her father, I did put in the chat lots of ways to order her book, depending on where you are tuning in from. There are links, and please, copy the link, and depending on where you are, you get a discount if you follow those links. So I encourage all of you to get to read the rest of the story that she shared with us today.
Thank you very much, Krista. And in fact, the excerpt I read was from the first chapter. It's called "Homeland is Lost." And this is the quote from Arabesque by Anton. The quote says, "The man looks dead to me. It's like being dead to lose a home overnight, a black night like this one, and be condemned to wander Allah knows where." And so this quote, when I read Arabesque, it was so powerful. I believe even before I started my book or even thought about writing my book, I underlined it because it was just so, it just really hit home. Condemned to wander God knows where. And that's what happened to so many hundreds of thousands of refugees. Anton's book, I believe, in some ways was a turning point for me for several reasons. First of all, the fact that this was my relative. And the fact that this is someone who knew my mother and loved her very much as his cousin, and really was completely heartbroken by her death, and communicated that to me when we got in touch eventually. So there's something in the book, I mean, it's very, very personal, in addition to the story that I'm reading. Anton brings scenes alive from the village. And he does it in a way that really evokes something poignant or bittersweet that makes you want to laugh and cry at the same time. His style of writing is very powerful and really pulls you in. And in fact, it's very interesting that, the way things come up sometimes, because the book is actually right next to me now. I last read it a number of years ago. And when I was last in the village at Christmas, I actually brought it back with me because I want to read it again. It's one of those books that you want to read again. I encourage our listeners very much, if they haven't read it, to do so. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah, I have a copy that he had given me at the time in English, and then actually I think he gave me the German one because I know German. My father's German, and so I have it in German and English, which is always interesting.
And I also identify a lot with Anton for another reason: the fact that Anton chose voluntary exile and never returned, and I can understand.
Yes, I mean,
excuse me, I can totally,
he's not alone in that. I know.
Yes.
You talked a little about your, I guess I want to ask you, as I'm a fellow writer. I've written a memoir, which I'll be publishing later this year, on Palestine as a mother of 3 Palestinians and a strong background in the Middle East. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how becoming a writer has changed your life in terms of your identity as a Palestinian.
Yes, Krista, I think becoming a writer sort of makes you live life in a deeper way, in a more aware, highly aware kind of way, because you are really looking at things and analyzing things all the time. So just as a few simple experiences that I will share with you. Whenever I have any encounters in Ramallah or in the north, I'm always thinking of them. I'm always thinking about what this means in the wider context, where this comes from, who are the people I'm interacting with, what it means in the context of the story of Palestine. When I began working on the book, and I began interviewing my family and friends of the family and others, it was really a complete awakening for me. I really came to know my family and our family history in a way I never would have done if I had not written this book. I knew the general history of my parents. I knew what had happened. I knew, of course, the general history of Palestine, like every Palestinian does. But this level of detail I would never have looked into it so deeply if I had not consciously wanted to find out the story and to relay it to the world. Becoming a writer in that way has helped me come full circle, both with our story as Palestinians and with my own personal family history. So it's been very powerful in that sense. And it's also, the phrase that they say, once you know, you can't unknow. It really pushes a much deeper understanding on you, to the point where sometimes I do ask myself, as I'm sure every writer does, wouldn't life have been a lot easier had I not began on this journey? Because at times it's so painful. It's very painful. The discoveries that you make, the history that you read. Our history as Palestinians, I mean, is so tainted with pain and with atrocities and with, so many things that were done to us. It really is, I come out of it feeling a deep respect, despite everything, for the fact that we are still even nearly surviving as a people. Because when you read all of the history from start to finish, it's really gut-wrenching. And you really wonder, how these people still even exist. We are up against a very formidable enemy that has done and is doing and will continue to do everything in its power to erase our presence. For me, writing this book was a way of affirming that presence as well, of saying, no, we are here. This is our history. This is us. And the Hasbara and everything that Israel does is not really, will never take that away.
Wow, thank you. Awad is wondering how Israel gets away with singling out the barring of return for Palestinian refugees. I wonder if you could comment on that to the best of your ability.
Krista, Israel is funded and aided by, the Western world, and particularly by the United States, as we all know, to a very large degree. There is an infuriating double standard in dealing with the issue of Palestine-Israel, because Israel is allowed to get away with anything, and the Palestinians, who are the wronged party, are accused of being terrorists. That's the simplified version. Israel has managed, and we have to go back a little bit at history to look at this. Right back from the British mandate, from the days of the British mandate, which the Zionist movement used to get its foothold in Palestine, the Zionists positioned themselves as an agent for the West in the Orient. And that's how all of this began. So they aligned themselves at the time with the British colonial powers. And they, if you look at the early British writings of the Zionists and of people in the Jewish Agency, it says, I have a quote somewhere in the book, it says, they saw themselves as, bulwarks of civilization in this barbaric world. That's how they envisioned it. Since then, they have basically played the political game of protecting the West's interests in the region in return for being protected by the West. This continues to be the case today. With time, of course, historically, we saw the development of a very powerful Jewish lobby in the United States that really stops or prevents any real fair movement on the Palestine issue. And Israel continues to fund Israel with billions of dollars annually. So Israel really gets away with it because the rest of the world is complicit in this disaster that is taking place. Europe very much is also complicit. Unfortunately, what we see as Palestinians, there are millions and millions of dollars of aid are poured in here every year, but nothing is done towards a political solution. Only lip service, only reports and recommendations that we read time and time again. But on the ground, nothing is done. No sanctions, nothing meaningful on any level that could really hurt Israel and force it to change its policy.
Thank you for that. Question from me. How do you compare your life in Fasuta and Ramallah?
Yes, they are two almost different worlds. This may be shocking to some listeners, given, we are all Palestinians, but unfortunately, the divide created by Israel between the still occupied territories, including the West Bank, and the Palestinian minority in Israel runs very deep. They have succeeded in creating a divide that is not just physical, but also cultural and to a large extent political. This was done by immersing each side in its own problems, such that it's not really able to relate so much to the other. In my own experience, when I go to my village, it really is going to another world. There, I'm a member of the Palestinian community inside Israel. I'm an Israeli citizen. That means that theoretically, at least, I get to enjoy the privileges of any citizen. In practice, however, that means I'm discriminated against in almost every facet of life. There are no business initiatives sponsored by the state in our communities. Our communities are not given space to grow. Many homes are under threat of demolition because people in the end have to build because they're simply not given licenses. The level of care on every level is far inferior to that of Jewish communities. New Jewish communities continue to be built and supported by the state while we continue, in the same small areas that we inhabit. When you try to find a job, when you get on a bus, when any interaction at the Social Security office, at any government office, at any public outlet, you feel the animosity, you feel nervous and tense even in speaking Arabic. When I come to Ramallah, I can speak in Arabic. I'm among other Palestinians. There is no Hebrew in the immediate vicinity. But in Ramallah, I'm joining the 2 million or 2.5 million or so other Palestinians in the West Bank who are effectively living under Israeli occupation. I have to cross a checkpoint in and out. It's a very stressful experience because people are often killed at these checkpoints and none of the soldiers are ever made accountable. When you come inside Ramallah, you feel the huge difference in terms of infrastructure and so on. They really try, but they are still far, far inferior to the infrastructure inside Israel by virtue of Israel being also a much richer country and the foreign aid that it receives, which I mentioned earlier. Inside Ramallah, I get to feel more as a Palestinian. People are still resisting. People still talk about the occupation openly. When I'm in Fasuta, there's no mention of this, or people talk about it in hushed tones, only the few that are particularly politically aware. Otherwise, and I've stopped blaming people for this in a way, otherwise people really just have to get on with their lives. They have to get on with their jobs, with their work. They have to be part of the system, basically, in order to survive. So there are two starkly different realities. One thing that is making me very hopeful is in recent years, there's been a lot more of Palestinian community in Israel that is coming to Ramallah to visit, to meet people, to get introduced to the society, and slowly more and more connections are being formed.
Thank you for that. I think we are out of time here. We're going to wrap up. We thank you so much for sharing your book with us and taking the time to spend with our audience today. It's been a very fascinating conversation, very, very powerful book, and we all look forward to reading it. Thank you, Krista, for your thoughtful questions and fielding the questions from the audience. Thank you for the audience who joined us on Zoom today and the ones who also joined on Facebook. Our program next week on Saturday, we hope to have a live session from the opening of our re-exhibition of the Venice Biennale exhibit, but this time it will be exhibited in Rome at La Accademia di Belle Arti di Roma, which is the most prestigious art academy in Italy, and we're very excited about that, looking forward to it. We hope to provide live coverage of the opening ceremony, which takes place around 5 p.m. Italy time, which will be 11 a.m. US time on Saturday, 6 p.m. Palestine time. And on Sunday, we are showing an Israeli film that's called Objector. It's about an Israeli young woman who refused to serve in the army and ended up sentenced to time in prison. And she will join us after the film to answer questions and have a discussion with the audience. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Yeah, we look,
Fida, if I
Yeah.
could just ask Fida, you mentioned that you like readers to get in touch with you and give you feedback on your book once they've had a chance to read it. What's the best way to get a hold of you?
You are very welcome to contact me on Facebook. It's my name exactly as you see it here. And I will also now in the chat, I will actually write my email. I would be very happy to hear from you. So jiryis@hotmail.com. And in part, on my part, I would also like to thank Krista and Faisal very, very much, really, for giving me this opportunity to be with you today and to speak to you. And really, thank you so much to the wonderful comments from all our listeners and for being here with us. Thank you with all my heart.
thank you. And as we say at the end, مع السلامة.
مع السلامة.
السلامة.
شكرا مع السلامة.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
take care.
Bye
Bye.
bye.